Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Police are looking for someone they say fired a shot into the Obama campaign field office in Denver yesterday. No one was hurt, but people were inside the office at the time. And police in Libya say a car bomb placed underneath a patrol car exploded during a failed assassination attempt on a police colonel in Benghazi this morning. We'll be talking more about Libya later in the show. Right now, I am joined by Richard Kim, my colleague at TheNation.com, where he is executive editor, Goldie Taylor, contributor to our sister website, TheGrio.com, Amy Davidson, senior editor at The New Yorker, author of the Close Read blog at TheNewYorker.com, which I should just say has been absolutely essential reading for the last few months throughout this campaign. You should definitely check it out, The Close Read at TheNewYorker.com. Michael Moynihan, cultural news editor at Newsweek and The Daily Beast. It's fantastic to have you all here. Thursday's debate between Vice President Joe Biden and Congressman Paul Ryan was a pretty substantive contest between two men who were well briefed and pretty much on their game. Conventional wisdom going in was twofold. Biden needed to calm panicky Democrats in the wake of President Obama's flat performance last week and Romney's subsequent polling bounce. And he needed to set the stage for his boss to regain his footing during his second debate with Mitt Romney this Tuesday. I think Biden accomplished that mission. And I think what made the difference was that Biden was aggressive, uninhibited by preoccupation with preserving his own image, and adept at leveraging his experience and stature. In probably the single best exchange of the night, Biden wasted no time calling out Ryan for his apparent hypocrisy when it comes to stimulus funds.
Look at just the $90 billion in stimulus. And the vice president was in charge of overseeing this. $90 billion in green pork to campaign contributors and special interest groups.
I'm not allowed to show letters, but go on our website. He sent me 2 letters saying, by the way, can you send me some stimulus money for companies here in the state of Wisconsin? We sent millions of dollars. You know why he said
you did ask for stimulus money?
Sure, he
correct?
did. By the way,
on 2 occasions, we advocated for constituents who are applying for grants. That's what we do. We do that for all constituents who are.
Oh, I love that. I love that. This is such a bad program, and he writes me a letter saying, writes the Department of Energy a letter saying, the reason we need this stimulus, it will create growth and jobs.
My favorite part of that clip is that is the Biden embellishing, saying he sent me the letter. He then corrects himself. He didn't actually write the letter to Joe Biden, but it's such a gilding the lily moment. It's like you imagine Paul Ryan like taking out his iPhone and like texting like, Joe, any way you could hook a brother up with some green contracts? All right, later Joe Biden made an argument for Democratic policies on social insurance based not on numbers or actuarial projections, but on the record and reputation of the two parties.
Choice and competition. We would rather have 50 million future seniors determine how their Medicare is delivered to them instead of 15 bureaucrats deciding what, if, where, when they get it.
Who you believe? The AMA, me, a guy who's fought his whole life for this, or somebody who would actually put in motion a plan that knowingly added $6,400 a year more to the cost of Medicare. Now they got a new plan. Trust me, it's not going to cost you any more. Folks, follow your instincts on this one.
I love that moment because one of the things I found, I mean, if you imagined the mirror image of this, if you imagine the Democrats running a national campaign for president in which they were going around saying, we are going to cut taxes for the rich the most. Listen to us. We're going to cut taxes for the rich the most. And you would say, well, that's not what you believe in. It's not what your record has been. Why should we? And so what's been amazing is to watch this battle happen over Medicare and Joe Biden just reduce it to, I think, what is the essence. Which of these two parties do you really think is going to stand behind Medicare in its current form? I mean, whatever Paul Ryan says about we're going to protect you or it's not going to be that bad, just look at the record and the vision and the ideological commitments. I don't think this is disingenuous. I think the different parties and different coalitions have different views on this. And I thought that Biden moment where he said, just trust your instincts on who will protect Medicare was a really powerful one.
Well, that's why Biden won, because you were saying about shoring up Democrats. He reminded them also not only that they could win, but why they were Democrats and what they were fighting for, and that it's possible to make a strong argument for it.
For the Democratic position.
Yeah.
I think the emotional argument there is actually
quite clever because, I mean, the most soporific moment in this debate was when Paul Ryan sort of receded into numbers. I mean, this was what he was famous for. He was being a bit wonky, and he's the clever one in a party that's sort of bereft of ideas. And that is actually much more effective because, you know, I was with people who were nerdy about this stuff during the debate, and everyone was sort of looking around and saying, good God, Ryan. But when looking at the camera and saying, well, who do you trust? Do you trust these guys? Do you trust us? I think that was much more effective.
And that was a particularly good moment, I thought, for Biden, because the question that preceded all that was so tinged from the right wing. I mean, the question that Martha Raddatz asked was, we all know Social Security and Medicaid are going broke. What are you going to do about it? They, in fact, are not going broke. Social Security cannot ever go broke because it's transfer payments from one generation to the other. So for Biden to remind people that this is how these social programs work and this is why we have them, I thought, really turned a question that had a right-wing angle around in his favor.
I think something much larger happened, that night. If you take the position that the Republican Party has placed its bet on Paul Ryan, that it has heralded him as its intellectual leader of the party, that is the person who is going to carry the banner, into the next generation for this party. We learned that night that house is a house of cards, and Joe Biden blew it down.
I don't think he was that bad, though. I mean, look, on balance, I mean, and I say this independent of whether I agree with him or not. I think that the two, I mean, there's very two distinct styles of debating here. One
yes,
one is blowing air horns and shooting guns. I am going to not look at you. I'm going to be very serious. And I think that his command of the numbers, and now we can get to the fact of whether these numbers are right or not, but I think that he handled himself well. I didn't think that he kind of folded under the pressure of Joe Biden or the moderate.
I don't think he was very good on the numbers. He was very vague on the numbers, and a couple of times she's asking him, tell me how this math works, and he's just like, we're going to figure it out later. I think the way he exceeded expectations was, he knew when the Afghan fighting season was, and he sort of recited a couple of things that people thought were his weaknesses, but in what people thought were his strengths, really articulating a vision for the future of social programs and the budget and how that was all going to work. I thought he was surprisingly weak.
I would say quickly, though, that is, in a way, the weakness of Paul Ryan in that debate, was that there was somebody that was doing so much by rote. It was a weird thing.
And that seemed evident, particularly when Martha Raddatz, I think, and we'll get into foreign policy in a bit, when she would ask follow-up questions, and it was that moment in class when you've, read the Cliff's Notes.
Exactly. It's revealing that he was actually weak on the numbers, something he's known for being, this sort of golden wonk boy of Washington, because he's not actually running on the Ryan blueprint.
That's part of it.
He's running on the Romney plan and the Romney pivot to the center. So the numbers he knows about Medicare privatization, about Social Security, all that, he can't go out there and campaign on those.
And that was one of the really interesting setups. And this gets to, I kind of want to make a contrarian point about specifics, because we've been saying, on MSNBC and the center left about specifics, and the specifics don't add up. But I actually think the more important thing is specifics are less important than what is the constituency of the two political coalitions and what are their commitments. Because, we all remember Barack Obama ran an entire primary campaign against the individual mandate. He was not. That was the signature policy difference between he and Hillary Clinton. They must have had 40 debates in which all they talked about was the individual mandate. And then he got in and he chose the individual mandate because that's what the world of center-left wonkery had basically established as the framework for healthcare. So for me, the reason that Biden moment when he looks in the camera and says trust is that the specifics are going to matter much less than who is empowered in these respective coalitions when it comes time to actually govern. Who's empowered in the House Republican caucus that's going to be calling the shots? Who's empowered in terms of Mitch McConnell, whether he's a minority leader or majority leader in the Senate? And who's empowered in the world of essentially conservative wonkery on policy? And it really is a matter of which political coalition you trust more than what numbers are showing up.
Well, Ryan was speaking to a constituency that doesn't really exist. The people who are never going to grow old, never going to be vulnerable. It's what Mitt Romney was saying. If you're over 55, don't listen.
Stop listening, yeah.
And Ryan was saying, for the old people who we've already made a contract with, that old contract is in place, but we've got a new one for people who are never going to need anything, are never going to be vulnerable in the way that people who are already old are. But those people are going to.
They're not a different kind of person. They're just at a different stage in the life cycle.
Yeah, and those people know it, too.
I mean, there's a consistent problem with Republicans addressing issues of spending, because there are two things that they do have to address.
Yes.
And both of those, it's entitlements, so Medicare and Medicaid, and defense spending. And what do we get on either of those? And sorry to be sort of a libertarian on this issue, but they're never addressed. So you get these squishy, vague things because they don't want to talk about things that will annoy people that they hope will vote for.
Well, and they've also made this. They've
They've
made this totally corrupt from the standpoint of their own ideology, corrupt generational bargain in which they say welfare state for the older voters who skew Republican and we need to win, and privatization for everyone else. And there's just no ideological.
Well, they're also making the bet that these two people don't know each other.
That's right. That's a great idea. That's a great point.
Grandma, who is 75, is not in tune with the news or doesn't care about what's happening to her grandchildren who are 25 or 30.
My grandmother never cared, but that might be very specific to my family.
Or that someone like me is intensely worried about my Social Security dependent mom and whether or not she's going to have to go out and bargain for, her Medicare benefits. Or if I am going to have to get on the phone on her behalf and haggle, or me pay the difference, or that she does not have the difference available.
This is such an important point. This is such an important point because the idea that you can, it's so cynical to me. It really bothers me, I have to say. I mean, it bothers me in the same way that Scott Walker's very cynical policy in Wisconsin of we're going to exempt the firefighters unions and the police unions from this because they support Republicans and we can just sort of divide and conquer. This kind of corrupt, don't worry, don't stop listening if you're over 55. Who cares for the people that are over 55?
Absolutely.
They're kids. It's not like they're uninvolved.
Right.
So if your 75-year-old mother is going to have to shop around for health insurance, guess who's going to be doing it? Voters of America who are 40 years old. You are going to be doing it.
It's very transactional. It's also saying that the reason we have a commitment to the older people isn't because these policies have been a triumph and ended.
Just because we promised.
Because we promised. Sure. We made a contract. We'll keep that, but then we're going to make a new one.
But who is actually, this is going to your point, Chris, who is actually the constituency for privatizing Medicare? Who is actually calling to privatize Social Security? It's not vast segments of the American population. It's the libertarian wing of the Republican Party, as well as private equity, hedge fund managers, the financial class, who stand to make billions, trillions, if that is accomplished. So that's who I think we should actually look to.
And Social Security entered the debate for the first time. It was one of a few issues, abortion, Social Security, that we hadn't seen addressed in the first debate. Social Security entered the debate, and it was a fascinating moment because it was a moment when Paul Ryan 2.0 had to argue with Paul Ryan 1.0 and sort of reconcile the two. And I want to take a look at that right when we come back.
You were one of the few lawmakers to stand with President Bush when he was seeking to partially privatize Social Security.
For younger people, what we said then, and what I've always agreed, is let younger Americans have a voluntary choice of making their money work faster for them within the Social Security system.
We will not privatize it. If we had listened to Romney, Governor Romney, and the congressman during the Bush years, imagine where all those seniors would be now if their money had been in the market. Their ideas are old and their ideas are bad.
Their ideas are old and their ideas are bad. Straightforward, sort of. The Social Security moment to me was fascinating precisely because Romney was able to pull off something in his debate that Ryan couldn't quite do. Because Romney had pandered to the right of the party. He had done it largely rhetorically, even though he had not been a really hard right governor of Massachusetts because he was constrained by a Democratic legislature. And so he could just forget everything he said on the stump for a while. But Paul Ryan, his whole career has been being a creature of the world of conservative think tanks and the conservative wing of the Republican Party. And so he had this record, right? He was the one he crafted a Social Security privatization plan that was to the right of the plan proposed by George W. Bush. And he couldn't just run away from it and say, no, I don't believe in that anymore. So he ended up having to sort of defend these things. And I think that got him into a lot more trouble than Romney got into.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, the idea that, sort of privatization or private accounts is an incredibly radical thing. I mean, you can argue against this. I mean, Sweden, where I lived for many years, has private accounts. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be this boondoggle that benefits private equity. But no, he didn't. I mean, look, without arguing the specifics of his plan, he didn't make the case in any sense.
Right.
I mean, there was kind of a stuttering, looking around, dazed.
Partly because he couldn't, right? I mean, that's exactly the problem, is that he couldn't didn't forthrightly make the case because that's not the ticket's position.
Look, I know. I mean, it's not that he's incapable of it.
Right.
I mean, he was certainly capable of doing it, and it wasn't that this wasn't part of his debate prep with Ted Olson or something. He just didn't want to get into that for a variety of political reasons, which showed.
But there's still the misconception there, and I think the moderator, and to an extent Biden played into it, that Social Security is almost like a private account, like a 401k that you put money into and the government manages. That's actually not what Social Security is. Social Security is you paying for the older generation's retirement, and when you get older, the younger generation will pay for your retirement. It's the epitome of the social contract across generations. Now, there is a problem because there are going to be more old people than there are young people and productivity issues. So it's not like, the financial worries are irrelevant.
But you know what I found very interesting in this debate, in the broad context of the campaign when we talk about social insurance, which has been probably the central theme, I would say, in a weird way, even though there's, joblessness is rampant and we have this, is that people have different conceptions of those two programs as essentially there's an account somewhere with my name on it because you get the statement from the Social Security Administration. And because when you get your paycheck, it says this is how much you put into Social Security, this is how much you put into Medicare, and other government programs, that's just government, right? But people feel they have an ownership of those social insurance programs, and it actually means that people who are ideologically disposed to not like redistribution love those programs because they say, and you see interviews with Republicans all the time around who, keep the government hands off my Medicare, that's I have paid into that thing, and then I'm going to get it back, right? I've paid into the system, I'm getting back. And it actually made me think, maybe we should just line item everything else, right? Maybe you should just, have this spot on your payroll. It's this is the roads, and this is the, this is the cushion if you ever lose your job and need food stamps, right? That you're paying into these accounts all the time.
And I think that's really the crux of it. Keep your hands off of my stuff.
Right.
And so when you hear them call the president a socialist, what it really means is don't give my hard-earned money to those other people. And when you look at things like Social Security, when you look at things like Medicare, even Medicaid, other entitlement programs, whether and other social infrastructure, roads, schools is a big piece of this thing. You are taking my hard-earned money and you're giving it to those other people who aren't working as hard as me. And Republicans have built their entire ideology on this, over what it looks like generations now, and it just isn't going to work out for them.
Well, but I think that's because the power of Social Security and Medicare is precisely the power of people not viewing it in that way.
Well, that's also why Ryan had a harder time than Romney did. Romney, every contradiction he could sort of go back to saying the states are laboratories. We were experimenting in Massachusetts. This worked for Massachusetts. I'm not saying that I'm going to do it to anybody else. Ryan has spent his whole career in Congress.
Federal legislator.
He spent his whole career writing letters about getting stimulus money and, on one side, and on the other, talking about federal programs and what he wants to do with them.
I would say just to that point, you don't find a lot of passion for Paul Ryan amongst libertarians. It's a very interesting thing, too, because right when you come out of the gate, you have the Ayn Rand tag. This is some sort of objectivist nightmare who's going to be on the vice presidential ticket. You look at actual libertarians, and they point out the same things that Joe Biden's pointing out. They also point out bailout stuff that,
he voted for TARP, he voted for the auto rescue plan.
Both of them. Right. And, Ayn Rand would be very disappointed in that, as somebody who took Social Security. So.
Well, yeah, that's right.
Which was revealed recently.
Not only that, he also, we dug up a clip of him making the case for stimulus under Bush in terms that were directly kind of counter-cyclical Keynesian terms. He also, I keep hammering on this, but it is important, and this comes from Michael Grunwald, whose book about the Recovery Act. He voted, along with the Republican caucus, for a $700 billion stimulus. So when you say when you attack the Recovery Act, as he now does, and as Republicans do, as a preposterous notion, as a ridiculous, out-of-left-field idea that you would borrow money from China for this counter-cyclical policy, the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats on this was $130 billion. They voted for a $700 billion stimulus. What passed was $830 billion. They weren't that far apart. The other big issue that we had not seen in the debates yet that came up, choice, abortion, right after this. There was a lot of activity on Twitter during the debate as it went through about women's issues and choice. It's weird to call it women's issues. It is primarily women's issues, but it's an issue for everyone. Over choice and contraception and birth control and access to, because it has been a big issue in the campaign and it didn't get any treatment at all in the first debate. And as we got through the first hour of the second debate, I saw this tide building on Twitter. This is crazy. We need to talk about this. Martha Raddatz did end up asking a question about abortion. I think a lot of people felt, and I share that feeling, that it was bizarrely phrased. Basically, it was about asking each of the candidates, who are both Catholics, how does your personal faith affect your view on abortion? This was Paul Ryan's response.
You want to ask basically why I'm pro-life? It's not simply because of my Catholic faith. That's a factor, of course. But it's also because of reason and science. I think about 10 and a half years ago, my wife Jana and I went to Mercy Hospital in Janesville, where I was born, for our 7-week ultrasound for our firstborn child. And we saw that heartbeat. Our little baby was in the shape of a bean. And to this day, we have nicknamed our firstborn child, Liza, Bean. I understand this is a difficult issue, and I respect people who don't agree with me on this, but the policy of a Romney administration will be to oppose abortion with the exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother.
Paul Ryan once said the exceptions for life of the mother was a loophole you could drive a Mack truck through. So again, another place where he's different than the ticket. Joe Biden answered after Ryan, and this was his response.
With regard to abortion, I accept my church's position on abortion as what we call de fide doctrine. Life begins at conception. That's the church's judgment. I accept it in my personal life. But I refuse to impose it on equally devout Christians and Muslims and Jews. And I just refuse to impose that on others, unlike my friend here, the congressman. I do not believe that we have a right to tell other people that women, they can't control their body. It's a decision between them and their doctor. In my view, in the Supreme Court, I'm not going to interfere with that.
Why did I find this exchange so unsatisfying? There's something about it. Is it just because this is the most trod territory in all of American politics, and if you give people 5 minutes, you get essentially everything that you expect and have heard before? Is it?
I think it's because there weren't more follow-ups. I actually did not have a problem with this question and the way it was framed. It is the way a lot of people think about it. I did feel that it came so late in the debate and it just got compressed. I think they were running out of time that and Biden was, although he was disciplined in a way, this is probably the one section in which he didn't laugh at all or...
Well, I think that was a good thing, right?
Yeah, that was a good thing. That was a good thing.
What a hilarious question.
But he wasn't quite as disciplined about saying very quickly, I'm a Catholic, but then getting to the not imposing and getting to exactly what Ryan and Romney are proposing and what they're suggesting. And he did eventually get to it. But the other thing that's strange about the abortion exchange, and that does make it unsatisfying, is the idea that only having restrictions for rape, incest, and life of the mother is somehow moderate.
Sure.
Because it's, Ryan is more extreme than Romney on it. But that's pretty extreme in itself.
And that's what, I think Biden did a very good job defending, the sort of principle of not imposing the government on women's bodies. But he didn't really tie Ryan or Romney to the extreme right of the GOP, which has passed all these, ultrasound bills and restrictions on abortion that de facto make it impossible to get in many states.
Sure. I think there were like 1,100 pieces of legislation that went through state houses around this country, that sought to restrict and severely limit women's access to reproductive health care. I think that the bigger issue for me in not having any of these social issues, whether they were women's reproductive rights, education, other things mentioned in the first debate, and then even as an add-on in the second debate, is that people made I call the excuse that, this is that jobs, as if social issues are not also economic issues, especially reproductive choice, that when women have, history has shown us that when women have control over their reproductive choice, it also lends to their control over their economic destiny. And that's really, I think, what this is about for a party that portends to say that we want smaller and less government, they certainly want to put an awful lot of resources in between me and my doctor.
There's also this mismatch that I also find frustrating, which is Marsha Blackburn, is a congresswoman from Tennessee, was on MSNBC's coverage after the debate. And she responded to Chris Matthews' question about abortion by basically saying, well, I know you guys want to talk about this, but let's talk about jobs. And the other day on Twitter, I was talking about abortion, and a lot of conservatives said, why are you liberals always talking about abortion? You have this weird thing in which conservatives in the Republican Party really don't want to talk about this. In fact, Ryan had this big sigh and this kind of gathering himself moment after he was asked the question. And yet what they are doing at the State House level or even the House, it's not like they've stopped battling. They want to legislate on it. They just don't want to talk about it. And it seems to me that's unfair. I mean, if you believe in this, go out there and make the case. Make the case, the state parties are doing a ton of restriction on abortion. There's 38 bills that Ryan's co-sponsored restricting abortion. The first bill they came out with, remember, the House Republicans won on the Tea Party deficit, and the first thing they did was try to defund Planned Parenthood basically in the first week that they convened the House.
And Ryan said something incredibly important there, also somewhat in code, softened down. He said, we don't want unelected judges making these decisions. That means overturning Roe v. Wade.
Right.
They want to get rid of Roe v. Wade. That is what they want.
I'm not even sure how coded that is.
That's pretty. And I want to actually play a clip of the one moment the Supreme Court came up, because I thought that was fascinating. And Michael, I want to hear from you on this right after this break. We're talking about abortion entering the debate for the first time in the first two debates. We've seen about an hour into the debate on Thursday night with Martha Raddatz, and each of the Ryan and Biden both gave responses essentially outlining pro-life and pro-choice positions, and then there was a discussion of Roe v. Wade and the court, and I thought this was very important because it's remarkable to me. We've talked about this. We did a whole Supreme Court preview. The fifth vote upholding Roe v. Wade, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, is a 79-year-old cancer survivor, and that seems pretty germane to what the jurisprudence on choice is going to be. Here's the exchange between Ryan and Biden on that topic.
We don't think that unelected judges should make this decision, that people through their elected representatives and reaching a consensus in society through the democratic process should make this determination.
The court, the next president will get one or two Supreme Court nominees. That's how close Roe v. Wade is. Just ask yourself, with Robert Bork being the chief advisor on the court for Mr. Romney, who do you think he's likely to appoint? Do you think he's likely to appoint someone like Scalia or someone else on the court far right that would outlaw abortion? I suspect that would happen. I guarantee you that will not happen. We picked two people. We picked people open-minded. They've been good justices. So keep an eye on the Supreme Court.
Was there a litmus test on them?
There was no litmus test. We picked people who had an open mind, did not come with an agenda.
This whole litmus thing drives me crazy. They just got saying this should be in the democratic process, okay? If you believe it should be in the democratic process, then the democratic process is the process that produces the president who then chooses the nominee. It's much more transparently democratic if there is essentially a litmus test so that people know what they're voting for. Yeah. Instead, we've shrouded it behind this norm of open-mindedness and no litmus test, which is anti-democratic, right? If you actually believe the issue should be settled more democratically, then we should know, and we know what the two parties' positions are.
Of course there's a litmus test.
Of course there's a litmus test. That's my point.
I think there was a litmus test for Bork, who had views that people thought were a bit bonkers. But watching that, I just noticed something that kind of Joe Biden is telling the Supreme Court that two of you might die. Yeah. By the way, which is the one thing I think he's saying. One or two of you might not make it. And there's the judges are going, God, is it going to be me? Who's next? It's terrifying.
The other thing he's doing is the exact same thing he did on Social Security, which is basically saying, who do you trust on this? And you trust, and it's also goes back to also the his offering of the 47%, and Ryan's really unsatisfying answer on that. It's like, do you see people this way, or do you not see people this way? And he managed to do that at a few points, especially.
But and I thought him saying it that clearly, it kind of violated some of the political norms about how we talk about the court. And you saw Ryan saw an opportunity to pounce. Are you saying there's a litmus test? Because for some reason we've all decided that a litmus test is something that we can't have. But it's like this bizarre fiction. Everyone who's operating in the world understands there's one party that's pro-life, there's one party that's pro-choice, and they're going to appoint justices.
There's two things this week. It's a litmus test and politicizing. We're politicizing.
Yes, exactly.
Of course we are. This is what the whole election's about, is politicizing.
And you know, the Republicans are, I think, in a very difficult position when it comes to the Supreme Court, publicly, politically. You know, their right flank holds up people like Scalia as absolute heroes.
Scott Brown.
Roberts is like the big evil guy now, right? And that was the moment in the Brown-Warren debate when he mentioned Alito as his hero. And you could see Warren just like immediately cackle with glee at the opening. But that's a sort of fissure they have to gulf. You know, talking to their right-wing constituency and also appealing to independents and moderates.
And I think that this is, when you were talking before the break about specificity, I mean, look, it's an obvious point. It's one that needs to be reiterated with Romney, is that this vacillating position on abortion, whether it's from Massachusetts to Iowa the other day, well, it's not going to be a sort of thing that we're going to care very much about, people. Wink, wink. And then back to this debate and Paul Ryan, it's like the reason no one wants to talk about this because they haven't formulated a coherent answer on this.
He's tried to outsource it to every other agency except his. He said, well, this is not a decision I would make. It's the decision the Supreme Court would make. Who is appointed by, right? Or there's no legislation I know of that would overturn.
But Richard, there would be no litmus test.
The loss in this section was, really asking them, what about a woman in this situation? Imagine, a woman who's gone through this. Todd Aiken, the whole idea of a rape victim who is pregnant, or even just a woman whose life is hard.
The ironic part about this is that Paul Ryan was supposed to fix this question for Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney, over the course of his political career, pro-choice, some exceptions, legal and rare, and down to this very draconian place where he wants to overturn Roe v. Wade, but I'm not going to push any legislation on my agenda. Paul Ryan was supposed to add to this ticket a level of conservative bona fides, to make certain that evangelicals trusted Mitt Romney on this question. He didn't fix it. He's made it worse. And I think that you're going to find, and I don't know what the polls are saying about this, I think you're going to find that, voting against Barack Obama, yes, is a enthusiasm pusher for some on the right, but this question will keep some of them tamped down.
I think he fixed it on the right. I think the problem is that the position that Paul Ryan has is not a popular position broadly in the country, and the official position of the Republican Party, let us remember, in the platform is advocacy of an amendment to the Constitution that would grant personhood 14th Amendment rights to a fetus, to a fertilized egg. I mean, that's an extreme position, that's the official position of the Republican Party. All right, politics can be bitter and nasty. Why that's a good thing, coming up next. My story of the week, the beauty of process. ABC's Martha Raddatz did, I thought, on the whole, a pretty good job moderating Thursday night's vice presidential debate, particularly when asking questions on her area of expertise, foreign policy. We'll talk about that in just a second. But her final question of the night about the negativity and sordidness of electoral politics really bothered me. Here's what she asked.
I recently spoke to a highly decorated soldier who said that this presidential campaign has left him dismayed. He told me, quote, the ads are so negative and they are all tearing down each other rather than building up the country. What would you say to that American hero about this campaign? And at the end of the day, are you ever embarrassed by the tone?
That soldier, of course, isn't alone. Lots of Americans feel the same way. I've heard the same thing from random voters I've interviewed in every campaign I've covered. And it's a recurring theme among the political press paid to cover politics to bemoan the nastiness and negativity of the thrust and parry of electoral politics. But it's an impulse we should collectively resist, because it contains the kernel of an insidious view of the value of democracy and even diplomacy and bureaucracy and the manifold ways that we as human beings channel and resolve conflict in a nonviolent fashion. The same distaste for the plodding, clunky, at times flat-out ugliness of process in Raddatz's question was on display in Paul Ryan's repeated attacks on the administration's UN-based diplomacy on Iran.
When Barack Obama was elected, they had enough fissile material, nuclear material, to make one bomb. Now they have enough for 5. They're racing toward a nuclear weapon. We've had 4 different sanctions to the UN on Iran, 3 from the Bush administration, 1 here. And the only reason we got it is because Russia watered it down
It is true the UN can be maddeningly dysfunctional, that the constitution of the Security Council is an accident of history, and that Russia's objections to any and all U.S. proposals can seem to Americans truculent and spiteful. But what exactly is the alternative? The answer is violence, war, death, and bloodshed. Which brings us to the announcement yesterday from the Nobel Prize Committee of a somewhat unconventional choice for this year's recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, the European Union. The announcement occasioned a whole lot of snark stateside. Karen Tumulty of the Washington Post tweeted, "Not a good sign if the EU asks that its Nobel Prize be paid in some currency other than the euro." Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic tweeted, "Next year, the Nobel Committee should consider awarding the Peace Prize to puppies." Slate's Dave Weigel tweeted, "You know who else has gone several decades without committing genocide? This guy right here, Nobel me." The team over at Fox and Friends also mocked the committee's decision.
The Nobel Committee praised the EU for 6 decades of efforts to promote peace and democracy in Europe.
Really?
And those are your
fantastic
headlines.
We should have the sports writers do it. They're better at picking the Cy Young.
Yeah. The EU can only hope there's a cash award with that. They could use some money right now.
It's true. Europe isn't in the best of shape right now. The limitations of its governing structure are causing institutional dysfunction, widespread misery, and threatening to terminate the entire project. Greece, submerged in the misery of austerity, is seeing fascists gain traction, administering brutally violent beatings to political enemies in a fashion horrifyingly reminiscent of Weimar Germany. But to mock the EU is to lose sight of what a tremendous accomplishment it has been. On a small patch of earth that was site of some of the most horrifying war, violence, brutality, sadism, and genocide in the history of human life on the planet. In a span of 6 years, at least 40 million people perished on Europe's soil, and the EU was constructed as a means of bringing peace and stability to a continent that had more or less known only war. The European Union doesn't have a whole lot of defenders at this moment in its history, but mockery of the EU rests on the same impulse we see in the laments of the nastiness of our presidential campaign and the huffing and puffing and the inadequacy of Iran diplomacy. In each case, the process may be messy and ugly and torturous, but it's almost always better than the alternative. Conflict is part of the human condition. There are limited resources, there are differing interests and cultures and tribes and value systems with different conceptions of the good, vastly different priorities and first principles. Democracy is a system we've come up with to resolve those inevitable conflicts. But there is no such thing as a placid equilibrium in which those conflicts somehow disappear or are only articulated in the gentlest of fashions. That is the point. Conflict is the underlying constant of human society. The question is what we do with it. It's only a slight exaggeration to say that we either have people killing each other in the streets like dogs, or we have people running attack ads against each other. Bureaucracy, parliamentary procedure, extended multilateral talks, the back and forth of campaign ads are largely gloryless enterprises. In the grand sweep of history, they are beautiful, sublime achievements. They represent nearly unthinkable progress and point the way towards a future of full human flourishing. How the debate over democracy, bureaucracy, and the UN played out at Thursday's debate, right after this. Joining us at the table now is Michael Hastings, author of The Operators, the wild and terrifying inside story of America's war in Afghanistan, a BuzzFeed correspondent and contributing editor to Rolling Stone.
Thanks for having me.
All right, I want to talk about, we're going to talk, you've been doing some really great reporting on Libya. We're going to talk about it in a bit. But first I want to talk about foreign policy debate. It was the first time that we got to see foreign policy debated. The first debate between the president and Mitt Romney was only domestic policy. And I thought it was really strange and illuminating, the foreign policy debate. Because to me, there were two main takeaways. One was the critique leveled by Paul Ryan of the foreign policy of the Obama administration was essentially stylistic. That the foreign policy rhetoric is insufficiently tough, that there isn't this performance of American toughness that is insufficient to Paul Ryan. And here's just a little montage of how that sounded.
We wouldn't refer to Bashar Assad as a reformer. We're not projecting weakness abroad. We should not have called Bashar Assad a reformer. It makes us more weak. It projects weakness. We look weak. This invites weakness.
The Bashar Assad a reformer was like, that was the only line on Syria policy, was that we said this one line. So that's the critique largely was rhetorical. Now, when you talk of the three hotspots in the world right now, in the Middle East particularly, not necessarily in the entire world, which is Iran, the war in Afghanistan, and Syria, there wasn't, as far as I can tell, any policy disagreement that they were leveling. Take a look.
These are the most crippling sanctions in the history of sanctions.
Thank heavens we have these sanctions in place.
What more would they do other than put American boots in the ground?
Nobody is proposing to send troops to Syria.
We are leaving in 2014. Period.
We agree with the administration on their 2014 transition.
Michael, what did you make of this?
When I saw Paul Ryan talk about Afghanistan, it was like watching Bambi on ice. The guy was so out of his depth. It's like he had a Boy Scout camp trip there once and saw the mountains and thought he was an expert. Look, but very specifically, Ryan got really tripped up on Afghanistan. As he said, look, we support the administration's position of a 2014 drawdown. And then a few minutes later, he said, oh, but we're opposed to deadlines, right? So right there,
those two things you cannot say both, right?
Right, and then he tried to level the criticism that Biden and the White House should have listened to the military commanders more, but that also means that you're going to try to extend the war and add more troops, which isn't a popular position. So he had to kind of back away from that as well.
And this is one of the dodges that they've used in their Afghanistan policy, which I think has been totally incoherent and irresponsible, I have to say. I mean, and I disagree with Barack Obama's Afghanistan policy when he campaigned for president. I disagreed, and I'm no expert on this. I'm just saying what my own opinion, where I'm coming from. I disagreed on the surge of adding more troops. I think we should bring home the troops faster than 2014. That's where I stand. But the critique of it from the Romney campaign, they have hidden behind this procedural question of essentially the general should make the decision, which is just a dodge way of leveling a critique and also not advocating the thing you really apparently want, which is to stay longer.
To stay longer. Exactly. And I think when Romney and Ryan have talked about Afghanistan, they've got themselves in trouble because they cannot say they want to stay longer. And then the other response say, well, we'll listen to the generals. Well, what if you disagree with the generals? Are they really going to just listen to the generals if the generals want to stay for another 10 years? And I think that's unclear.
The other thing, going back to the sort of stylistic element of that portion of the debate, I think it's because we didn't actually have a foreign policy debate. We had a debate about U.S. military policy and U.S. military intervention in 3 countries.
That's a good point.
Right? We didn't actually discuss
intervene or not intervene.
Climate change, Mexico, Latin America, China. Brazil, China, India, any of those things.
I want to hear more from you on foreign policy right after we take a quick break.